There's so many disclaimers I could put on this, and I'll try to point them out when I can. But this is a sketch, trying to get some ideas out there, maybe some new vocabulary for people. And as usual, it will be wide-ranging. I only have 50 slides for 30 minutes, which is, if you ask most people, better than usual. So I'll do my best. So I want to start with this idea of the difference between nature and artifice. I will say, just from the beginning here, I am not arguing that complexity does not exist in nature. Obviously it does, and obviously a lot of what we just heard Alicia talk about would apply to what would be referred to as a natural system. I am particularly interested in this talk to try to point out the difference, I think, between complexity in a natural system and complexity in an artificial system, and why design has something to do with that and what the implications of that are. I have a kind of a strange way to introduce artifice, but I like it. So Hannah Arendt, in her kind of one of her masterworks, The Human Condition, starts by kind of talking about the launch of Sputnik. And when she's talking about this, she kind of talks about the idea that man has, for the first time, kind of like tried to leave the planet, tried to leave the terrestrial boundaries that he's been in, or they've been in forever, and escape into the heavenly bodies. And there's a huge amount of interesting kind of metaphors and things that you might play with here around the idea, how we get to this moment and read this moment, especially the way Hannah is reading it, having to do with the relationship between natural philosophy and natural religion, and the way that we kind of view the kind of extraterrestrial planes and things like this. It's just an interesting moment to notice where man is trying to escape the condition that he finds himself in. And I think largely what Hannah was talking about in this kind of beginning chapter of her book is that man has been kind of, in high school, we would have called it man against nature as a theme. There's still a direct interaction here, or a direct relationship that Hannah's pointing out about man's relationship to nature and the struggle that man has to survive in nature and live in nature, and how this moment of escape into the stars was a moment of him trying to escape that nature. So I think there's some interesting ways to think about that moment of like launching first into space. And then I think there's this weird bookend that I like to try to point out something different, which is Bruno Latour just released a new book called After Lockdown, with a reference to the COVID lockdown. And in it, he talks about this idea of looking up at the moon as the only last way that he can comfort himself. Because now, when he looks around at everything that that used to be considered natural, lakes and trees and rivers and mountains and scenery and the things that we would think of as nature, he feels that humans have impacted it in some way, have changed it in some way. I like to think of this in a way as, during the Enlightenment, we have this moment where a bunch of philosophers kind of awaken to view the world through a different way of seeing things, rationality, and starting to form natural philosophy and then the scientific method, so that the world is revealed to them in a certain kind of way. We would call that an objective way. And this is a moment at which a similar kind of enlightenment is happening, I think. And for what Latour is talking about here is roughly that he's awoken to realize that the world that he lives in is almost completely artificial. There is all of his interactions, even with things that we might consider to be natural, are through artifice or through some sort of lens that makes everything appear as if humans have, managed or touched or changed the world in some way. And so this is, like, to me, like an interesting way to think about it, because then he starts talking about looking up at the moon, and the moon is the last thing that he can see that he feels no responsibility for. There's no human interaction with the moon yet. The moon is doing what it's doing without the kind of direct kind of interactions of human beings. So I think that's one way to kind of start thinking about, like, the way that we have started to move from the end of World War II, when Hanna was writing, to the acceleration of the Second Industrial Revolution, and really the impact of what people would call nowadays the Anthropocene, or the fact that humans have to realize that they have put an indelible mark on the planet and have become responsible for their own potential survival or non-sustainable interaction with the environment that they have created. So we get this kind of divide between nature and artifice, and I think that there's some interesting kind of things that roll out of this. When we look at the Enlightenment, natural philosophy, the kind of natural religion ideas, all of those ideas, there's a really kind of interesting tension in them because of the, a lot of readings of the Enlightenment was kind of a rejection of religion, kind of the Nietzschean version. But really, initially, a lot of natural philosophy attempted to right itself, or to work within religious connotations, and a lot of that ends up being interesting in that we want to eventually take a God's eye view. We want to, in a way, using the scientific method, become godlike, become non-subjective, objective observers of the world. And there's a lot of interesting ways to talk about kind of the clockwork universe, and the way that was a important way for people to think through how to use science with religion at the same time. But the result of it is kind of a very direct focus on kind of deductive, inductive rationality. And then there's this really interesting thing that happens kind of, post-Nietzschean, positivistic kind of accounts, where they become, and you can see this like really a lot right now in kind of the atheistic scientific literatures, a real focus on like a non-teleological evolutionary theory. And what I mean by that is that they were trying to say that there is no, there eventually becomes this separation between kind of science and religion. And one of the things that has to go is the idea of a grand designer, or the argument from design has to go. It's got to get out of there. And the way they do it is by basically saying the only way to remove the final bit of subjectivity from our scientific observations is to say that evolution is completely non-theological. It has no future. It has no designer. And then from there, we end up kind of removing any sort of agency from arguments about how things kind of got the way they were. And we produce systems where things like root cause can be found, and a real kind of strong subject-object, subject-othering way of looking at the world. So that's kind of like the result of taking that kind of nature version of things. On the other side, I think what is kind of coming into thought, or trying to be thought through, is this idea that if we keep on applying the rationality that we developed to deal with the first system that we thought through, the natural systems, to artificial systems, we might not get what we want. And there's I think some reasons for that. One, I think in artifice, or in artificial systems, the idea of abduction, and particularly this weird idea that that multiple hypotheses may not only be valid but true in an artificial system, in a way that naturalized kind of philosophy of science would find hard to understand. They want to have a specific condition. So we get these ideas like contributing factors and the way that things kind of happen, or the causal functions end up being like more like clouds of causes that interact and overlap and reinforce each other. And we get a different aspect there. We also get this idea of like an actor or actant. Actor is generally kind of, we can use it this way. We can say like it's a human with intentions, whereas an actant might be something that influences or causes things to happen in a system that without intention. And those things end up being in the loop. So there's this, now all of a sudden there's this idea of intentionality in the system. There's some intended outcome that people wanted. So now that is now reintegrating the teleological theories, right? It's not a God that's doing it, but it's individuals that are doing it. But the system itself got the way it was, not simply because of some sort of like billiard ball causality without any completely objectively observed, but in fact that there were actors in the system creating it. And that's maybe what we kind of mean by artifice in the first place. Another like really quick point, I think it's really important when we talk about artifice to like differentiate it from unnatural. I think there's this weird cross-contamination between the term unnatural and artificial. So unnatural has a lot of negative connotations associated with it, because it's specifically goes all the way, I think, back to Aristotle and Plato around the idea that one of the things that happens in the world is that there is an ideal form. And every time it's reproduced, it degrades, it becomes less like its nature. It loses some properties in reproduction. And there's a whole kind of rant about that to go through. But unnatural has this idea of contamination in it or badness in it. Whereas artifice, I think, should be more thought of as kind of the product of human intention or craft or technique, these types of things. So kind of keeping that separate might be useful when we think through this, so that we don't have that kind of like, like sometimes I think of like artificial flavoring, like the way that's people don't like artificial flavorings. So that's one of the things we should say it's an unnatural flavor as opposed to an artificial flavor. Anyway, I think there's some interesting kind of things that we could poke around with around what the nature of things is, or what the properties of things are. And in the original kind of natural systems theory, the kind of scientific view of things, we would have this idea that like three different levels, I think, of properties, like ways in which things, we describe things as being natural or not. So we have specific natures, so specific properties. So those would be properties that belong to individuals or specific things. So that apple is red is a specific property. We can move up from there to more environmental properties, which we might call a set of local properties. These have to do with like the way in which an environment then shapes an individual. So in my kind of understanding or thinking about this, one of the weird things about kind of, and Alicia, points towards this too, and a lot of this kind of naturalized science, one of the things that you end up having is that the individual is shaped by an environment. They're not embedded or looping or kind of entangled in the environment. The environment is kind of like doing things to the individual. And you can also see that same kind of weird abstraction where the individual is like in the environment as like a bowl that they're in, with terms like autopoiesis, which is kind of like this theory that the individual can kind of self create itself from itself. And there's good things and bad things to say about that, and we can certainly walk through that. But there's something specific about that autopoiesis in relationship to this other term that I'll get to in 2 seconds. And then from the next level, we have kind of universal law, and this would be like E equals mc squared and, Newtonian physics and things like this. These are things that, at least as far as we're aware, apply what I would call everywhere at every time. So atemporally and aspatially, they occur as far as we're aware at all kind of spaces. Of course, we can go into like scales and things like that, and things change. But anyway, universal law being kind of the replacement for kind of God mechanics, I guess. So from there, I think if we look at it more from an artificial system, we can see a shift again, where in an artificial system, we might think of specific properties as being constraints on the configuration of components. So that, in other words, instead of thinking of the specific properties as being things that are kind of self-contained within the object, we can think of them as the way in which those properties either enable or disable the ability to have that object or that thing configure with another thing. So you can think about like shape, or like, this gear has 13 gears, and that's a property that it has, which means that it can interact with these other gears, which have whatever 8 gears and certain toothings, right? So the properties in these kind of artificial systems have more to do with those interactions, so that even the individual properties are about configuration and reconfiguration, as opposed to about the thing in isolation. In a similar way, when we kind of move up to kind of local things, we can think of it more as kind of like the way that an environment creates enabling constraints, creates, sometimes I say it creates the playing field that the game will occur on. In Alicia's talk, she talked about the rules of the chess game. All of those things would be local properties or local natures, having to do with kind of the way that the environment is set up. And we would also get these other kind of senses of local, because we would get a move away from kind of a pure environmental view to a situational embeddedness there, where the individual actors and actants are in a situation, and therefore they're responding to something that's not simply kind of, again, like a bowl, but like a play that's ongoing. Like they're interacting because something is there already. Sometimes I say, to kind of get this situational embeddedness kind of feeling, as a designer, if you were looking at like a improv show, one of the things you would be thinking about is like, what props can I put on stage that make it more likely that something funny will happen? That's not scripting. It's not scripting the show. It's shaping the environment in a way that something is more likely to happen, right? So what would end up happening is the actors then would pick up one of those props, and the prop, the environment, would become part of the play, would become part of the situation in a loop that would stick the actors into the environment, not simply have them like near the environment, I guess. And the last one is kind of this kind of idea of symbiosis, which is kind of the idea that the same thing as autopoiesis, a way of kind of creating equilibrium in an environment. But symbiosis basically argues that all creatures, all kind of living things at least, they don't just evolve in reaction to this kind of like background environment. They in fact interact with other actors or other actants in the environment, and they create symbiotic relationships with each other that allow them to not only survive, but evolve. They evolve in relationship to other actors in order to kind of create the possibilities that they enjoy. So what I'm kind of interested in when I talk about these things, what I'm trying to kind of get at is I'm interested in this idea of a philosophy of design in the same sense as we might talk about a philosophy of science. So if a lot of the stuff I was talking about around natural philosophy, it eventually becomes what we call the philosophy of science, what I'm interested in proposing or talking about is that in an artificial system, we should have a kind of subjectivity in relationship to artifice, in relationship to artificial systems. And one of my arguments is that one of the reasons we find ourselves in the situations we find ourselves in, if that's anything from technical debt to a platform nobody wants to use to the environmental catastrophe that we're facing, all of those I think are because we have no good, we do not have at least an equivalent concept of being a subject to an artificial system as we do being the subject to a natural system. So science has successfully kind of encapsulated a way in which we can relate productively to a natural system. The question is, I think, can we apply that same rationality to an artificial system? And my argument is you can't. You get this more of the same, more maladaptive behavior. And in particular, I think that's partially because people kind of invert what reductionism does. I think most people think of reductionism as reducing the system to a set of parts, and therefore kind of missing the system. And really what I want to point out, at least in this, I don't necessarily know that's entirely wrong, but in this talk, what I want to point out is that what's actually being reduced equally is the subject. The subject's interaction with the world is impoverished by being reduced to simply a objective or subjective point of view. I have to be really careful. This is one of those kind of warning ones. I am not saying that any of the scientific discoveries you might make using a scientific method are wrong or are false or are not true. I'm just saying there are other ways of kind of interacting with the world. And if we only interact with the world as a kind of rational scientific subject, we will not be able to solve, I think, these artificial systems problems that we're kind of seeing around us these days. So now let's talk about kind of temporality. So imagine you're like standing at a table and there's an apple in the middle of the table. And so just to perceive the apple, one of the arguments that I would make is that you can't instantly perceive the apple. You can have an impression of the apple from a single point of view, but you immediately have more of what we would call an intention towards the apple. And what I mean by that is that you look at it and you think, I think that's an apple. I have a belief that it's an apple. And it means you have expectations about what that object is. And to make that clear, if you were to walk around the table with the apple on it and you kept looking at the apple, your expectation would be that if you got to the back of the apple, you would not find that it's simply a piece of paper mache that's hollow. That would surprise you. You would have your expectations would have been violated. And so your intention, your intentionality is that it's a whole apple, it's a complete apple. And therefore your perception of the apple, the way that you kind of see the apple and this concept of intentionality is temporal because it's essentially the stitching together of multiple views of the same object. So that, one of the ways to say this again is like, you don't perceive the apple like a film camera with like every angle of the apple is just another photograph from a different angle. There is somehow in your cognition a connection between each of the frames that says that this is the same object. It's not a new apple each time. It's the same apple, and I'm walking around it and seeing it from different sides. So that's one initial kind of way in which human subjectivity, human kind of perception is always temporal. It is always in time. It is never without time. It's never, it always has to be kind of this flow. And so we could talk about that. Merleau-Ponty kind of talks about it this way. He kind of, you know, there's an idea where he says like, so retention is that the retention protension is actually from Husserl, but Husserl basically says like, as you walk around the apple, you have like, retention is kind of like a memory of the last view you had of the apple. And protension is that expectation that the next thing you see of the apple will be like this. And therefore, those retentions and protensions are what make what is immediately present meaningful to you. And we'll get to that in a second. I think there's a subtly easier way to understand that. But Merleau-Ponty also kind of points out this idea that it's not simply that you kind of get these slices of presence, but these smearings of things all together, so that your current observation is informed by what you've seen and what you expect. A subtle thing here to say would be, you know, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty would both kind of argue that retention is not what we would call memory. It is some other version of kind of lingering image, I guess. And so, you know, one of the ways to kind of think through this, I think, is to think about like when you listen to a song, you don't listen to one note at a time. You don't hear one note. When you listen to a song, first of all, there's tonal relationships, like there's a scale, and therefore you're listening initially to a note in relationship to other possible notes that could have been played, but also in sequence with other notes. So, you know, one of the ways I try to talk about this is to say there's a really weird thing which you can try to think through, which is like, how do you hear an entire song? Well, the song that you hear, the way you imagine the song in your mind, is some sort of whole, but to experience it, you always must experience it in time. And there's this other kind of subtlety having to do with that expectation thing, which is music kind of works by the note that you're hearing in relationship to the notes that you've heard suggest that certain other notes are likely to occur next. And so you have some expectation about what you'll hear next. And there's this really interesting kind of way that music works that I think has to do with this. Music is only successful in that it entrains you by satisfying a certain number of your expectations, but it entertains you by violating a certain number of those expectations. So the way you kind of get into a song is that it's got to kind of give you a pattern, and then occasionally it's got to violate the pattern to be entertaining. So that's the way it kind of plays off of itself. And you'll get, as I continue to talk, I hope you'll get this idea that there's always, I used to use the word balance, but it's tension, I think. It's this tension between things that creates kind of the engaged flow of experience through time and makes things meaningful. And so there's this last one around temporality, which, you know, so you can think of narrative frequently as kind of like a set of constraints on your experience. Like if you find yourself in a situation, one of the ways to make sense of the situation is to say, I've seen this narrative somewhere else. I can imagine that this is what story I'm in, and I can make decisions by imagining what the actors in that story were going to do. That's kind of how narrative works as a system to create meaningful interactions with the world. But one of the things I try to point out sometimes, kind of because I'm a designer, is that the narratives aren't top down first. I think they're bottom up first, because you first have to look around and see what's in, again, to use the improv theater idea, what props are here. And then from there, you can decide what narrative you think you're in. So I think, again, this idea that the narrative, the temporal logic that you use in a situation comes from the material environment that you find yourself in. So All right, just really quickly, so I don't lose too much time on this. But I also, in my description, I talked a little bit about kind of Galileo. One of the things I want to point out really quickly, it has to do with this entanglement idea that we'll get back to. The interesting thing to me about Galileo is, I mean, there's this idea that he changed the world by changing us from kind of a Earth-centric to heliocentric system, and he did that by looking through a telescope that he made. He made a telescope, and he looked through it, and he made the observations that were necessary to prove that things were orbiting the sun, things weren't orbiting the Earth. I think, again, a little bit like that, the dragon story. I think the thing that gets missed often from that is that the construction of the telescope is the construction of the ability to make the observations. So there's this constructed nature to the knowledge that Galileo made. It has an artificial object in it. It's got an artificial system in it that is embedded in the factuality of the observations he was making. That doesn't make the observations any less factual. So when people say that something is constructed, it doesn't mean that what was constructed is any less factual. It just means that someone created the equipment or the technology to enable us to observe those facts. If you do software engineering, or if you do kind of a technology adoption or transformation, this idea that that there is often the need to create or to instrument something in order to make it observable, in order to create the change that you want to make, becomes, I think, really important. And there's this embeddedness, again, of human decisions into the system. Alicia also kind of hinted a little bit towards these ideas, I think, in her talk around kind of Kuhnian scientific revolutions, where if you decide telescopes are stupid and you have all the money, nobody ever makes a telescope. And then we don't ever get those observations. So I think there's some interesting ways to think about, again, science is not a drunkard's walk. It is an intentional system that designs and intends to create certain types of facts. And those things are not completely objective. There's a subjective, constructive part about that. So let's talk about complexity really quickly. I want to break down complexity a little bit so that we can have a little bit better thinking about some of what I'm interested in with it. And so I kind of break complexity, types of complexity, down into these three different types right now. We've got kind of like ontological complexity. So ontological complexity, you think about like the heterogeneity of the components. So like a system with a more heterogeneous set of components might be more complex than a system of homogeneous components. The composition of the components, so this would have to do with the relationships and the ability to compose and decompose them. That has some sense of complexity in it as well. Whether the system's hierarchical and has those mereological recursions in them. And also there's, in ontological complexity, there's concepts of granularity. And roughly what I mean by that is when we say a thing, we point at a thing in a complex system, we have to create a boundary around it in order to say what we're talking about. Whether that boundary is like a real boundary or not is a whole separate discussion. But the result of that is that we can kind of like, you could say things like the granularity could be like, organism, or it could be ecosystem, or it could be planet, or it could be solar system. And all those different granularities end up having different epistemological, viewpoints on them, and therefore different kind of levels of complexity. And so the granularity becomes a kind of an important aspect of kind of navigating that form of complexity. And we have epistemic complexity. So, this is what I think a lot of people mean when they think about kind of design and complexity, is these latter two, the kind of practical complexity and the epistemic complexity. But so there's some very specific ones that we could talk about with epistemic complexity, including the difficulty in describing the thing. So a more complex system might require more terminology or words to describe it. The computational complexity having to do with more complex systems require more computational effort to accurately predict the results of them. Lots of stuff to say about that around Herbert Simon and some interesting kind of ideas around that. And also kind of epistemic complexity could have to do with like the recipe-ness of it, like how difficult is the recipe to describe. If you wanted to recreate this system, how hard would it be to describe it in a way it could be reproduced? So more complex systems might have more difficult, it might be more difficult to describe in a recipe format. And then the last one, which I call in use or practical complexity, has to do with the heterogeneity of the use of the thing. So can you use the hammer to hammer things as a door weight, as how many different ways can the object be used? And in a component sense, like the way that I think Alicia was talking about it, how many ways can you combine it with other things practically to create a practical outcome? The reproducibility of the thing, how easy it is it to reproduce the system so that, in most complex systems where humans are interacting with them, they degrade to some extent and need to be constantly reproduced. You could think of like why it's important to have kind of automated system rebuilds and things like this. Process difficulty, how difficult is it to operate the thing? How difficult is the thing in practice? Like you could think about the difference between how hard it is to do how hard it is to play like an oboe versus a piano, I suppose. And then gnomic, which has to do with like how many laws or constraints need to be in place for the system to be able to reproduce itself. So there's a kind of concept there that more complex, a system that requires more rules or less rules to be in place could be more or less complex in its outcomes or in its nature. So I'm going to go through this quickly because Alicia did this already. I take full responsibility for my terrible explanation of Alicia's work, but it's important to some of my stuff that I do later. So I try to say that systems about relationships between parts and wholes, and there's a bottom-up and a top-down version. I also try to point out that in a lot of mereological ideas about parts and wholes, I often feel like there's this missing idea, which is about the idea of the relationship between whole parts and whole parts. And what I mean by that is that in many systems, the part could stand by, could be removed from that system and put into another system and still be thought of as being something that is whole and retains its identity from one system to the other. The easiest way to think about this is you are a part of a team at work. You are a whole part of the team, though. You have a wholeness to you, and therefore there's these peer-wise relationships. So it's not just top-down and bottom-up, but it's also peer-wise. And I always try to point that out because I feel like it's missing in many things. But anyway, I try to explain the idea of mereological recursion or these interlevel interactions that Alicia talks about. I try to talk about it by creating a sequence, which I'm not sure Alicia would agree with. So we'll see how that goes. But I try to think of it as a sequence because it makes it easier for me to think through what happens, I would point out that I think if this is an actual sequence, it would happen potentially very quickly and not be necessarily observable in the order that I'm explaining it. But in my understanding of it, right? So the first, when you try to self-organize something, what happens is a set of components comes together to create a whole. That's a bottom up. And if we go back to that idea of specific properties, it's the specific properties of the components that determine whether or not those components can fit together into a whole. This is kind of like understanding the components, understanding how they fit together, blah, blah, blah. In a natural system, that could happen like chemically and other ways. In a design system, someone selects those things and puts them together. And so, again, that's this bottom-up moment that creates a whole. And then the second idea is that there's a creation of a feedback loop. And the way that I've illustrated here is the rough idea that someone sticks these components together, they put them in an environment. If the whole survives the environmental pressures, in other words, if the whole can sit inside of an environment and either productively produce value for something that cares about it producing value in an artificial system, or if simply it can reproduce itself in the environment, and therefore, it has its own, whatever, autoclitic or autoquitic way of working, then it becomes part of the environment. And also, because it's producing value in some way, because the interactions between the parts as a whole are producing value, there becomes a top-down effect where the whole is stuck together because somebody starts using it for something else. And so this is the entanglement that I think is super important to understand. It's the fact that someone starts using the new whole that arrives to do something with it that makes the top-down effect happen. It becomes valuable that those components stay the way they have been configured or put together. And so the result of this is that we get a bottom-up and top-down effect, a closure that creates a coherent whole. One of the ways I try to explain this sometimes that helps some people is to say that it's like a clique in high school, a clique like a group of kids who somehow randomly get together, and then they decide that they are a clique. They're a group that has some sort of internal coherence to it. They want to be together, and they want to be perceived as being together. And so they start creating rules about who's in the clique and who's not in the clique. And the weird thing about those rules, those top-down rules, is that they keep the kids together in the clique, but often it's really hard to determine who created the rules. It's not necessary that one person created the rules. It could be environmental or jokes or lots of different things that create the rules that keep the kids stuck together. And so that, again, is this how the clique kind of emerges out of an environment, and then the top-down system comes to stick them together and keep them together. So Alicia kind of goes on to say that when this happens, again, this is the thing that becomes important in my mind, is that when the whole comes together, the whole then has emergent properties that did not exist before the whole was there. And those new properties, in essence, create opportunities that didn't exist before, because the properties didn't exist before, and the properties create opportunities or possibilities. The fact that they're there now creates what we would call a phase space. And what I mean by that, or what I would try to explain that to mean, is it's not that that property is directed toward a particular thing, it's that that property opens a lot of different ways that that property could be used in the environment or by other parts to recombine or reintegrate with other systems, because that property now exists that did not exist before. That's what that phase space means. It's a set of possibilities. And so again, the fact that that occurs and the fact that that whole then becomes integrated into other things means that the whole needs to be regenerated, which becomes those top-down constraints. And so, you know, when I think about that, sometimes I want to talk about the idea of, like, most people in software engineering get the idea that, like, code that's not being used rots. So, like, if you have a feature in a system, it's often better to remove the feature if it's not being used, because the fact that it's not being used means that it's often not being tested well by the environment. And then when somebody starts using it, it's often broken after a while. It rots, it goes bad. So this reintegration of the whole, this idea that the whole becomes part of another whole, is that the way in which it's important that when you release a feature that people use the feature, or that the feature is exercised in some way so that it does not rot. Otherwise, it kind of disintegrates. So in software engineering terms, I think the ideas that this kind of mereological recursion or this kind of interlevel ideas that we're talking about, so Herbert Simon, I think, would call them nearly decomposable. And what he's kind of pointing out there is that when you look at, like, software components or organizational components like teams and things like that, they're not completely decomposable. In other words, they're not completely independent. They're not completely autonomous. They're actually always integrated in some way. And loosely coupled is another example of this. I think loosely coupled is the idea in architecture that these systems are coupled. There's a goal to keep them as uncoupled as possible, but the loosely coupled part is the recognition that without any coupling, they also wouldn't be interacting, and therefore they wouldn't be valuable. And then the opposite of that being kind of leaky abstraction theories, having to do with kind of penetrating interfaces that are there to maintain the loosely coupled system, but instead become leaky and stick together in unfortunate ways. And I think we can talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So let's talk about design. So we've gone through kind of temporality, complexity. What about design? So I define design as the intentional formation of purposeful systems. We talked about intentionality. We talked about the idea that having an intention is about kind of a future perspective on a thing, an integration, a temporal smearing of things. So when we intend to form something, we have an idea about what that thing should be or what that thing is as we form it. And the purposefulness, again, is about this idea that most of the things that we design are intended to create some sort of value. There's in an artificial system, most of the systems are intended to create some sort of value. And so Dilnot explains it like this. I think this is kind of like traditional versions of design. Someone says, I need a thing, will you help me? Can you get me an answer to my problem? And someone says, okay, let's look at the user context, let's define the user needs, let's do some expert analysis. This is the answer. This is the thing. And I think this traditional view of design, where there's an expert, someone in the loop that determines what it is that needs to be done and says this, you need to follow this specification, is kind of that a form of design that emerges from those natural systems theories that I talked about initially. And I think as we move into complexity-based things and kind of more temporal-based theories of design, the thising, this is the right answer, becomes problematic. And there's a reason, because this, when you create a this, it changes the user's context and therefore likely changes what the user needs. And therefore there's a loop. It's not a one-way system. It's not entirely reductive. It is a feedback loop. And the feedback loop makes it temporal, makes it kind of that intentional smearing, but it also means that the system is not stable. It's not stable in kind of a, rock formation kind of way. It is moving. The system is interacting with the users by changing the context that the users are in the first place. And this theory is called an ontological design theory. And this is the way to read this in this phrasing that Dillon wants to use. There is both a confidence that the designer has designed the right thing. So it's not like I'm offering any proposition in response to your question. I'm offering what I believe to be the right solution. I believe this is the right solution, but with a question. So it's a this with a like an opening on it. And it means that I think we should build this thing. This is the thing that we should make. But I'm open to seeing what happens when we make it. And so the interesting thing I think about this is to think about the idea that design is always evaluated in a context or in a situation. It's never evaluated in kind of like a crazy Newtonian space-time that's completely abstract from the design. It's always evaluated in a situation, in a particular context. This, because the user context is modified, right? And therefore, we have this idea that design is open-ended in these theories that I'm trying to point at. So design is not the production of an answer. Design is the production of a proposal. I propose that this is the way we solve this, and I think in a complex system that proposal is never resolved. It is always open. In other words, what I mean is that when you look at a chair, and this is maybe a way that Clive might say it, when you look at a chair, the chair isn't an answer to where you want to sit. It's a proposal of, do you want to sit like this? Do you want to sit this way? Is this the right way for you to sit? Would you like to? And the reason for that is because a chair in different situations, you may not want to sit in it. Like you don't want to take your lazy boy out to the beach. It's a perfectly good sitting system in the context of a living room. It's a terrible way to sit on a beach, I think. We could think about that differently. Maybe a dining table chair with skinny legs. So the result of it is that design, these propositions that I'm talking about, are always evaluated in a context or in a situation, and they're always not once, but continually evaluated in those situations. In this theory, I think, of kind of user context. So when we kind of look through this stuff and we try to think through, again, the difficulties of moving from kind of a natural science system to these artificial science or these artificial systems, these artificial design concerns, one of the things that I think I pointed out a little bit, but I want to bang on really hard, is that these artificial systems, these artificial complexities, they entwine human intentions. They entwine value, they entwine want, need, all these things, where value in particular is often very difficult to rationalize about. In a lot of ways, we would just simply call the evaluation of a value statement as an ethical decision. So these rational causality of kind of engineering and natural sciences is not actually available to analyze these complex artificialities, because entangled in the systems, in the evolution of the systems, is this oughtness, this it ought to be that way, and the rationality system expects these isnesses. It has to be this way, and so the causality and the analysis of, especially like the evolution of a system. The evolution of an artificial system is theological. It is purposeful. It did have embedded in it intention. It is not. It is different, substantially different, to analyze an artificial system than to analyze a natural system, especially the evolution of those things. Because in theory, when you look at the evolution of a natural system, the way that a natural systems theorist would want you to look at it, there should be causal reasons for all of the changes that are not theological. Again, as a kind of attempt to like this to warn off or to be careful here, not in any way saying that artificial systems are entirely made of oughts. In fact, massive amounts of them are made of is or kind of constraints-based kind of things. But some of those reasons that the system is the way it is because somebody decided I like it better that way. So I want to propose this. I think this is getting towards the end, and I think this is where I want people to kind of think about what I'm proposing in relationship to this murological recursion idea. So I want to propose that. So I use the term thing, by the way, instead of the term object when I'm talking about a design thing, where a thing is kind of like the gathering together of human concerns into an object, or the way in which an object can gather human concerns together. Like when I look at my watch, I'm concerned about the time, and the watch gathers that so that I can observe the time. So when initially designing a thing, what we're trying to do is look at the potential possibility, kind of the phase space theories that we were talking about, what's possible to do, and create a proposition in order to initially configure this designed thing that we're talking about. We need to put together some components. Maybe we need to add some novel components or whatever. We need to put the thing together. And that thing initially becomes kind of a proposal. And then we use the thing. So these two ideas, the kind of design of the thing by analyzing possibility and creating proposition, and then use and practice with the thing, are the initial things that happen when we design a thing. Now, I think that after we have a thing that we've used for a while, we often want to stabilize it. So we want something to assure us that the watch won't fall apart or that the house won't burn down. We want it to be stabilized. And then finally, once we have something that is an effective proposal that allows use and is relatively stable, then often we want to reproduce that thing. So we want to make more of them, or sometimes the thing that we're making is consumed in use, and so we need to reproduce it in order to reconsume it. So I think these are some of the relationships. And I want to argue that this first set of ideas, the potentials and the use, are first order constraints. They're things that happen first in the design process that constrain the thing. The proposition is a form of constraint. The use is a form of constraint that makes the thing, activates the thing in the environment, makes the thing observable, usable, things like that. And that to some extent, as the situation changes and as things are reevaluated, these are the primary things, the primary first order things that determine whether or not the design thing is effective or not, if it's valuable or not. And I think that the second order things, stabilization and reproduction, then become second order constraints. And what I want to propose when I talk about this, what I'm trying to point at, is this weird thing that happens is if you invert these things. So if you start overvaluing the stabilization and reproduction parts of the constraints on the system that allow stabilization and reproduction, often the result of that is it causes negative effects on the propositional or use-based parts of the system. And therefore, the system becomes overly stable or rigid, and therefore separates itself from the environment, becomes disentangled from the environment in ways that make it less and less useful. And this is a problem that we have to kind of think through when we kind of design these systems. We want to balance the relationship between these forces or these constraints. I'm trying not to use the term force, but the way in which these things work together. So one of the ways I think to think through that, and again, Alicia beat me to this as well, but I think is to think of the murology that we were talking about, the recursion, with two different ideas. So Alicia used the term hierarchy, and she pointed at the term heterarchy. So to me, a heterarchy is a set of components that can be reassembled into multiple different hierarchies. So it is a non-ordered set of things that can be reassembled or reconfigured into different hierarchical systems. And a homoarchical system is a set of components that can only be configured in a certain way. So like the way that I tend to think of that is like a homoarchical system, an idea, like a specific one might be like the military. A captain can't report to a sergeant. They've got to report to a colonel, right? There's a specific ordering of the hierarchy. And I think the important thing to note here is that there's a tension here between these two things. So homoarchies are very good for pushing on a system, for pushing on something, because they're very stable. And therefore, if you need to like have a thing that will resist the environment or resist change, Alicia described it a little bit when she talked about kind of organizations need to be able to reproduce themselves. No, she wasn't talking about a homoarchy, and I'm not suggesting homoarchy is the only way to solve that problem. But a homoarchy allows something more homoarchical, allows that stability to push forward. Heterarchical systems will be more dynamic and often more complex in a way, but they will be more responsible as situations change. And so there's a balance between these two, between the homoarchical and the heterarchical. And therefore, like often I try to explain that design decisions are often less kind of, or more like dragging a slider than they are about choosing one side or the other. So I think the important thing to point out here is that when we talk about like this idea of potential and use, those first order things would be heterarchical things. They would want you to be able to reconfigure the system, whereas the second order ones that I point out would be more homoarchical. They would want to create stability and reproducibility, and therefore they want to be configured in specific ways that resisted the environment. Really quickly, some implications of thinking this way, some ideas that you might take from the talk. Design is an ongoing proposition. It doesn't answer a question. It is always reevaluated in use. And therefore, when you think about designing things, like one of the kind of ones that I use with architects all the time is to say, architecture isn't something that you can, architecture as a process, as a design, isn't great if it's only a picture. It is observed as being a proposition of how the system should be, and that people engage in that proposition. They go, oh, that is the way that the system should be. I understand the proposal, and I'm going to engage in it in a feedback loop that allows me to move forward. Therefore, those propositions are chosen or created contextually or in a situation or situatedly. There's this tension that we're looking for when we talk about these complex systems, sustainable non-equilibrium. So I used to use the term balance a lot, and I try not to use that term anymore. I use this word tension because what we're looking for is this, that the system is both capable of reproducing itself and also changing. So it's sustainable non-equilibrium. And one of the other ways to think about that, if anybody who's seen my talks before knows I rant about autonomy. There's a difference here between freedom and possibility. In a complex system, the components of a complex system have more possibilities, but that's different than saying they're freed of their interdependencies from other things. It's in fact their interdependencies to the right level that give them possibilities. And it's not that they are autonomous, it's that they are interacting with other things, and those interactions are what create the possibilities. So that, again, the emergent properties of those systems is different than particularly American versions of what freedom means. I think that there's an important idea here to talk about when we talk about platforms. One of the ways I try to talk about this right now, when I try to get people to think about this kind of complex systems theory in architecture and platforming, is to say, saying like platform as a service, or saying that a platform is an interface is again not wrong, but it is not platforming. It is not where you could end up with it. If you take kind of an entangled complexity theory design view on a platform, it would be that the platform was more like that improv stage. It would be more like that the people would be able to co-create the platform, that they would not simply be like plopping things into the platform. They would be modifying, changing the platform. So like, some like sketchy versions are things like the importance of inner sourcing, the movement, honestly, from source to running components that can be interacted with, and ideas like that, so that platforming, to me, ends up being a type of problem that most architects and software engineering teams have not really dealt with. In most organizations, teams have not tried to solve shared concerns across multiple teams in order to create a platform. They haven't tried to do that. And so that is about the way in which a platform will create interdependencies between teams. And so much of the field these days is trying to like pretend that they can create abstraction layers between teams and between platforms and teams to keep them isolated from each other and autonomous. And that's not all wrong. But again, if we go back to that kind of near decomposability or those leaky abstraction ideas, the design choice is more about the right kind of interdependency as opposed to no interdependency. And trying to figure out how to do that for most organizations, I think, is a challenge these days. And I think it's one of the bigger challenges in architecture these days. I think that if we think through design as being propositional, one of the ways to think through that is to think about it as what's called erotetic logic as opposed to propositional logic. And that basically is trying to think through things as questions. And I like to think that that you can think through erotetic logic using a constraints theory that I can get into deeper later. Really paying attention to the way that ontological design works, the way that what we intend is what we attend to. So what we think should be there is what we pay attention to, and that creates a loop. And therefore that loop creates a way in which the systems that we design us back. They shape our attention, they shape our actions, and therefore they shape future systems and future systems developed. I think that one of the ways to think through some of these challenges is to, again, in a way where we're not trying to negate one side, but we're trying to open the possibility of another side, is to think through socio-technical architectures where the stuff on top would have more to do with the way in which a system is complex, and the stuff on bottom would have more to do with the way in which things have to satisfy certain constitutive constraints. They have to do certain things in order to exist at all. And that's an important concept to get through. And then I like this word. I think this is my last slide. I'm trying to convince people that we should replace the term socio-technical system with this socio-technicological. And there's this reason I'll explain really quickly. I think it's important that we understand the relationship between social systems and ecological systems first. I think that ecological system, again, as Alicia pointed to, feels more like a complexity, more like something that is a complex system. But I want the relationship between those two things to be acknowledged as being technology, but specifically the way that kind of the Greeks initially thought of it as techne, skillful. And so the way to think about the systems we build using this word, if you were going to think about it using this word, would be that social systems skillfully cope with ecological systems by creating artificial systems through technology. And it's the interaction and continuous interaction between the social and ecological systems through that skillful coping that allows humans to create sustainable artificial systems. And if we can't figure out how to do that better, we're going to be in a lot of trouble soon. Both from kind of I think from a software engineering perspective, just based on the systems that I look at on a daily basis, but also in a ecological frame as well. So thank you for listening to me rant. I had fun.